Attila the Hun, the rise of the Scourge of God. Ildico wept. Silent tears traced paths through the coal beneath her eyes. Beside her, Attila lay still. The Scourge of God, silenced on their wedding night. Had she grieved a husband she barely knew, or celebrated a victory no one dared speak of? The mystery of that night lingered, a dark stain on history's page. Attila. The name echoed through the ages, a harbinger of destruction. Emperors trembled. Peasants prayed for deliverance. They called him destroyer of cities, a shadow looming from the east. But who was the man beneath the legend? Where did the myth end and the truth begin? This is the chronicle of his life, from a shrouded childhood on the steppes to a bridal chamber-turned tomb. Before he commanded hordes, before cities burned at his command, he was simply a boy. The terror he inspired didn't spring forth fully formed. He rose from the dust of the steppe, carried on the wind, woven from birdsong and the scent of campfire smoke. To understand the man, one must journey back to his childhood, to a world where the earth was home and power was measured not in decrees, but in swift horses and loyalty to the blood. The year of Attila's birth remains a mystery. Historians place it around 380 AD, at the close of the 4th century, when the Roman world already teetered on the brink of transformation. The forging of a conqueror. His people, the Huns, already pressed against Europe's western borders. Their name was whispered with fear across the plains between the Volga and the Danube. These were not the first nomads to challenge the settled world, but they would prove the most devastating. Previous waves of migration had been absorbed, defeated, or turned aside. The Huns would reshape the very foundations of European civilization. Few wrote of the Huns, and most were their enemies. Roman scribes like Ammianus Marcellinus painted them as savage, almost inhuman, lacking architecture, writing, and compassion. Jordanes described them as a race savage beyond all parallel, while Procopius called them the most terrible of all in skill and courageous daring. Yet beneath the fear and propaganda lay a vibrant, complex culture, bound by its own laws, clans, traditions, and code of honour. The Huns descended from nomadic peoples who migrated from the east, perhaps from the heart of Central Asia, beyond the Altai Mountains where the sky seemed to touch the earth. Some scholars trace their origins to the Xiongnu confederation that had terrorized Han Dynasty China centuries earlier. Their language remained an enigma, a linguistic ghost that has baffled scholars for centuries, but their style of warfare became legendary. Lightning raids executed with surgical precision, composite bows capable of piercing armour at ranges that astounded their enemies, and swift cavalry manoeuvres that struck terror into the hearts of their foes. They perfected the feigned retreat, drawing pursuing enemies into carefully prepared ambushes. Their arrows could penetrate Roman mail at 200 yards, and their horses could travel twice the distance of Roman cavalry without rest. From infancy, Hunnic boys grew among horses and weapons. They learned to ride before they walked, it was said, and could loose arrows with deadly accuracy while hanging from their horse's side at full gallop. The horse became an extension of their bodies, the arrow a thought made manifest. Young warriors proved themselves through rigorous trials that would have broken the sons of civilized lands. They were wrapped in hides during bitter winters and doused with cold water to inure their bodies to hardship. Initiation rites involved deliberate wounds, cuts made with sacred knives to toughen the skin and mark the transition from boy to warrior. These weren't mere barbaric customs, but a systematic preparation for the harsh realities of nomadic warfare. Boys who failed these trials were denied access to weapons and relegated to tending herds. The steppes themselves were a harsh teacher. Winter winds could freeze a man's breath in his lungs, while summer heat baked the earth until it cracked like broken pottery. Water was scarce, enemies numerous, and survival depended on constant vigilance. Children learned to read the sky for weather, the ground for tracks, and the behaviour of animals for signs of approaching danger. In this unforgiving landscape, families moved with their herds in an endless cycle of migration, following ancient paths that had been traced by countless generations. The portable felt tents, called yurts, could be assembled or dismantled in minutes, allowing entire tribes to vanish from one location and appear miles away before their enemies could react. This mobility was both survival strategy and military doctrine, shaping every aspect of Hunnic culture. Attila's mother's name is lost to time, swallowed by the same silence that claims so many women of antiquity. Nor can we know with certainty the precise identity of his father, though later chronicles hint he belonged to a noble lineage, perhaps a war chief involved in early skirmishes with the Goths and Alans, who had settled in the rich lands north of the Black Sea. The steppe peoples traced their ancestry through oral traditions that stretched back generations, weaving together history and legend until the two became indistinguishable. These were not mere stories, but the very foundation of identity, teaching children who they were, where they came from, and what was expected of them. In this world, a man's worth was measured not by the gold in his purse, but by the deeds of his ancestors and his own prowess in battle. The education of a future king, the boy grew in a world where a tent was home, and the horizon defined the limits of his dreams. Each dawn brought new lessons in survival. Mornings began with martial drills, boys learning to string their bows with numb fingers, to grip their knives when their hands shook with cold. Days were spent with the hunt, tracking deer across frozen steppes or pursuing wolves that threatened the herds. Evenings belonged to the tales of elders, men whose scars told stories of distant battles, and whose memories preserved the oral history of their people. Songs sung around the campfire didn't praise distant gods dwelling in marble temples, but celebrated ancestors and their victories, defeats, and the lessons carved in blood and bone. These songs instilled more than entertainment. They were the curriculum of a warrior people. They taught the importance of clan loyalty, the understanding that each person was a link in a long chain stretching back to the first riders who had emerged from the eastern darkness. They spoke of honour measured not in gold but in the respect of one's peers, and of shame that could only be cleansed by worthy deeds. The education of a future chieftain involved more than warfare. Young Attila learned the intricate politics of tribal alliances, the delicate art of negotiation that could prevent unnecessary bloodshed, and the harsh mathematics of survival that governed steppe life. He studied the movements of the seasons, the patterns of rainfall, the behaviour of wild animals, and the subtle signs that warned of approaching enemies. Most importantly, he learned to observe and remember. The steppes were an oral culture where information was currency and memory was more valuable than gold. Those who could recall the details of past battles, the terms of ancient agreements, or the genealogies of rival clans held power that transcended mere physical strength. From a young age, Attila displayed a remarkable trait that would define his rise to power: keen awareness coupled with patient observation. He rarely spoke among his elders, but he absorbed everything like parched earth-drinking rain. He noted alliances and rivalries, lies whispered in shadows and truths concealed behind diplomatic smiles. Once, as a young boy, he accompanied his father to a meeting with a Gothic delegation near the Danube's muddy banks. The Goths had come seeking alliance against mutual enemies, bearing gifts of silver arm rings and promises of shared plunder. After the meeting, while others debated the words exchanged and the promises made, young Attila made a different observation. He had noticed that the Gothic envoy kept his hand hidden beneath his cloak throughout the negotiations, never revealing what he grasped there. The boy drew no conclusions then, but he remembered. Years later, when that same Gothic chieftain betrayed a Hunnic raiding party to Roman forces, Attila would recall that hidden hand and understand that some men carried their treachery like a weapon, always ready to strike. This became his signature, an uncanny ability to perceive details that others missed. It wasn't mere observation, but an intuition for weakness and hidden intent that bordered on the supernatural. Even in his youth, he commanded a peculiar respect from warriors who had seen decades of combat. He didn't shout or engage in the boisterous games that occupied other boys. He didn't seek to display outward bravery through reckless acts. Instead, he was respected for his silence, his intensity, the weight in his gaze that seemed as heavy and deep as the steppe night itself. Men twice his age found themselves glancing away when he stared too long. He had few friends, but many followers. His kinsmen, particularly his cousins, learned early one immutable truth. Attila did not forgive twice. Cross him once, and you might earn a beating. Cross him again, and you would simply disappear into the vastness of the steppe, your bones picked clean by wolves and your name forgotten by the tribe. The harsh realities of steppe politics shaped Attila's character from childhood. He witnessed the rise and fall of minor chieftains, observed how quickly loyalty could shift when circumstances changed, and learned that power without the will to use it was merely an invitation for others to seize it. These lessons would serve him well in the years to come. The crucible of war, according to the Byzantine historian Priscus, who would later meet Attila face to face, the Huns subjected their children to training that would have horrified civilized peoples. They were wrapped in hides during winter storms and doused with icy water to inure their bodies to hardship. Initiation rites involved deliberate wounds to toughen the skin and prepare the mind for the pain of battle. These practices were commonplace among the steppe peoples, and boys who failed were denied access to weapons and relegated to herding animals, a fate worse than death for a warrior culture. Attila didn't just endure these trials, he embraced them with silent resolve, not out of fear of rejection, but because he understood intuitively that they were the path of the strong. History offers scant details of his early battles, but tribal memory preserved stories of a boy who accompanied his elders on raids before reaching his 20th year. First came strikes against neighbouring tribes, disputes over grazing rights or stolen horses that escalated into bloody vendettas lasting generations. These conflicts taught young warriors the fundamental realities of steppe warfare. Unlike the formal battles of civilized armies, with their structured formations and predictable tactics, nomadic combat was fluid, opportunistic, and utterly merciless. Victory went to those who could adapt fastest to changing circumstances, who could read the flow of battle and position themselves where they could do the most damage. Attila learned to fight from horseback with bow and lance, to coordinate with other riders in complex maneuvers that required split-second timing, and to endure the bone-jarring impact of mounted combat that could shatter men who lacked proper conditioning. He discovered that courage alone was insufficient. Success required intelligence, preparation, and the ability to think clearly while death whistled past your ear. Then came the more dangerous work, skirmishes along the fringes of Roman territory, where the rewards were greater but so were the risks. Here he witnessed the behaviour of seasoned warriors in combat, learned the intricate protocols for dividing spoils, observed the swift betrayal of temporary allies, and watched the cold execution of prisoners whose tribes couldn't pay ransom. This was no school of honour in the Roman sense, with its emphasis on virtues and pietas, but a school of power where survival depended on understanding unspoken rules written in blood. The strong commanded, the weak obeyed or died. Mercy was a luxury that nomads could rarely afford, and sentiment was a weakness that enemies would exploit without hesitation. The Roman frontier presented unique challenges that tested every skill Attila had acquired. Unlike tribal enemies who fought according to familiar patterns, the Romans employed sophisticated defensive strategies, professional soldiers trained from childhood, and military engineering that could turn a simple raid into a costly siege. Attila studied these Roman methods with the same careful attention he devoted to tracking wounded prey. He observed how they constructed their fortifications, how they organized their supply lines, how they communicated across vast distances, and how they recruited and trained their auxiliary forces. This knowledge would prove invaluable when he later turned his full attention to the conquest of Roman territory. He matured during a time of unprecedented upheaval. The Western world convulsed as barbarian peoples pressed against Roman frontiers with increasing frequency and desperation. The Western Roman Empire hemorrhaged territory, losing city after city to Visigothic kings and Vandal raiders. The Eastern Empire survived by paying gold for peace, transforming proud Roman tribute into barbarian wages. Most significantly, the barbarians no longer merely knocked at the gates. They dwelled within the empire as foederati, allied troops whose loyalty could shift with changing circumstances. Attila observed this transformation with the calculating gaze of a born strategist. He realized that whoever could unite these disparate barbarian peoples would become more powerful than the emperors who feared them. The young warrior began to envision something that had never existed before, a barbarian empire that could challenge Rome not through random raids and pillaging, but through coordinated strategy and unified command. This vision would drive him for the rest of his life, shaping every decision and guiding every alliance. The ascent to leadership. By the end of his youth, Attila's name resonated among the nomadic tribes like the distant rumble of thunder promising storms. He was not yet a king, but he possessed something perhaps more valuable, the right to speak on behalf of his clan in the councils of war where decisions were made that would shape the fate of nations. Whispers circulated through the felt tents like smoke, carried by wind from one campfire to another. The old ways were dying, men said. The time of small raids and petty feuds was ending. Someone would emerge who would do more than extract tribute from frightened farmers, someone who would seize power itself, reshape the world according to his will. The steppe politics of the early 5th century were particularly volatile. The death of several major chieftains in quick succession had created a power vacuum that numerous ambitious leaders sought to fill. Alliances shifted like desert sand, and today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy if the balance of power changed even slightly. In this environment, Attila's reputation for reliability and strategic thinking made him increasingly valuable to the various factions vying for dominance. Unlike many young warriors who sought glory through reckless displays of courage, he demonstrated a mature understanding of when to fight and when to negotiate, when to take risks, and when to preserve strength for more important battles. His counsel was sought not only by his own clan elders, but by leaders from other tribes who recognized his ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to long-term consequences. This growing influence was carefully cultivated. Attila understood that political power often preceded military command, and that a reputation for wisdom could be more valuable than a reputation for ferocity. When Rua, Attila's uncle and paramount chief of the Hunnic confederation, died in the early 5th century, many expected the fragile alliance to shatter like pottery dropped on stone. The Huns had always been a collection of tribes held together by personal loyalty to a single strong leader. Without that centre, they typically fragmented into competing bands that warred among themselves until a new chief emerged. Instead, something unusual for the nomadic world emerged from the power vacuum: dual rule. Two nephews of the deceased ruler, Attila and his brother Bleda, jointly assumed leadership of the Hunnic confederation. This wasn't merely a division of inheritance, but a calculated political arrangement that would prove surprisingly effective. The decision to share power was not made lightly. The tribal elders who chose the new leaders understood that the challenges facing the Hunnic confederation required different skills than those possessed by any single individual. The Romans were becoming more sophisticated in their defensive strategies. Rival barbarian peoples were consolidating their own power bases, and internal pressures within the confederation demanded careful management. They didn't divide territory along geographical lines as civilized kingdoms might have done, but instead split responsibilities according to their individual strengths and temperaments. From the beginning, Attila demonstrated an inclination toward diplomacy, patient observation, and long-term strategic planning, while Bleda favoured more immediate displays of strength, personal pleasure, and the accumulation of visible wealth. Their partnership proved surprisingly robust and complementary. Where Attila was calculating and reserved, Bleda was bold and charismatic. Where Attila planned for years ahead, Bleda seized opportunities in the moment. Together, they transformed the Huns from a disparate military alliance of convenience into a unified force capable of dictating terms to the mightiest empire on earth. Information about Bleda comes primarily from Byzantine sources, especially the detailed accounts of Priscus of Panium, who would later have the extraordinary opportunity to visit Attila's court as an ambassador. These descriptions suggest that Bleda was the elder brother, possessed of considerable personal courage and military skill, but lacking Attila's preternatural restraint and gift for long-term calculation. During their joint rule, the Hunnic confederation underwent a fundamental transformation. What had been a loose alliance of nomadic tribes became something approaching a true state, with administrative structures, diplomatic protocols, and strategic objectives that extended far beyond simple raiding for plunder. The architect of fear, the brothers first sought to consolidate Hunnic influence within their own sphere, bringing under their direct control the various steppe peoples who had maintained nominal independence. They employed a sophisticated combination of violence and diplomacy, understanding intuitively that fear and reward were most effective when used together. Some tribes submitted willingly after witnessing demonstrations of Hunnic military superiority. Others required more direct persuasion in the form of punitive expeditions that left no doubt about the consequences of resistance. The strategy was carefully calibrated, enough force to compel submission, but not so much as to destroy the very resources they sought to control. Consider the fate of the Alanic tribes dwelling between the upper reaches of the Don and Volga rivers, in the rich grasslands that their ancestors had occupied for centuries. The Alans were formidable warriors in their own right, with a proud military tradition and sophisticated tactical knowledge that made them valuable potential allies or dangerous enemies. When initial negotiations for voluntary alliance failed, the Alanic chiefs proving too proud to acknowledge Hunnic supremacy, Bleda personally led a military campaign that would become a model for future conquests. The war was swift and brutal, conducted with the surgical precision that had made Hunnic warfare legendary. Hunnic cavalry struck simultaneously at dawn against 3 separate Alanic settlements, preventing any possibility of mutual support or coordinated resistance. The attacks were carefully timed to coincide with the early morning hours when most defenders would be sleeping off the previous night's festivities, a common vulnerability that Hunnic intelligence had identified through careful observation. Within a single day, the military strength of the Alanic Confederation was shattered, but what followed demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that distinguished the Huns from mere raiders. After victory, the Huns didn't massacre the captives or sell them into slavery, as many barbarian peoples might have done. Instead, they invited the surviving elders to a great council, where terms for the future were negotiated with all the gravity of a treaty between civilized nations. The proceedings were conducted according to ancient steppe customs that emphasized honor and mutual obligation, creating a framework for lasting cooperation rather than temporary submission. The Alans were offered not subjugation in the Roman sense, with its implications of permanent inferiority, but participation in a greater enterprise. In exchange for military service and acknowledgement of Hunnic leadership, they were permitted to maintain their traditional customs, religious practices, and internal governance structures. This became the template for future Hunnic expansion, not to destroy utterly and rule over ruins, but to integrate conquered peoples into a common system that preserved their identity while harnessing their strength. It was a model of imperial organization that would later be adopted by more famous conquerors, from Genghis Khan to the Ottoman sultans. The success of this approach was demonstrated by the fierce loyalty that former enemies often displayed once they had been incorporated into the Hunnic Confederation. Alanic cavalry would later serve with distinction in Attila's campaigns against Rome, fighting with the same dedication they had once shown in defending their own independence. During this period, the Huns solidified their position in Pannonia, the region that would later become Hungary. Here, at the crossroads between the vast steppes of the east and the Roman roads leading west, a permanent centre of power began to emerge. This wasn't yet a capital in the conventional sense. No massive walls of stone rose to mark its boundaries, but rather a sprawling headquarters where the threads of an empire came together. The location was chosen with characteristic Hunnic pragmatism. The rich grasslands could support large herds of horses, essential for maintaining the mobility that was the foundation of Hunnic military power. The Danube River provided both a natural defensive barrier and a highway for rapid communication across vast distances. Most importantly, the position commanded the key routes between the barbarian world and the wealthy Roman provinces to the south and west. Information flowed here from across the known world, reports from scouts monitoring Roman military movements, intelligence from merchants who served as unofficial spies, tribute from subject peoples, and the constant stream of prisoners whose ransoms or skills made them valuable. This intelligence network became one of Attila's most important assets, providing him with information that often surpassed what was available to Roman commanders. Weapons were stockpiled in vast underground chambers, protected from both weather and enemy raids. Craftsmen from a dozen conquered tribes laboured to forge the instruments of further conquest, combining traditional steppe techniques with innovations learned from captured Roman engineers and Gothic metalworkers. The workshops produced not only the recurved bows and iron-tipped arrows that were the signature weapons of Hunnic cavalry, but also siege engines, armour, and specialised equipment for different types of warfare. This represented a significant evolution from the purely nomadic lifestyle that had characterized earlier Hunnic society. The diplomacy of destruction. A pivotal moment in the consolidation of Hunnic power came through diplomatic engagement with the Eastern Roman Empire. Throughout the 440s, Attila and Bleda achieved what no previous barbarian chieftains had managed. They forced the emperor himself to treat with them as equals, extracting concessions that transformed the fundamental relationship between Rome and the peoples beyond its frontiers. The Romans had long relied on a strategy of divide and conquer when dealing with barbarian threats, playing different tribes against each other and preventing the formation of unified opposition. This approach had worked successfully for centuries, but it depended on maintaining technological and organizational superiority over their enemies. By the 440s, that superiority was beginning to erode. The Huns had learned to combine their traditional mobility and archery skills with Roman siege techniques and military engineering. They had developed sophisticated intelligence networks that rivaled anything the Romans possessed. Most importantly, they had created a political structure capable of coordinating the actions of multiple tribes across vast distances. In Margus, a fortified city on the banks of the Danube that commanded one of the crucial crossing points between Roman and barbarian territory, a treaty was concluded that obligated Byzantium to pay the Huns an annual tribute of £600 of gold. To appreciate the magnitude of this sum, consider that it represented nearly a quarter of the empire's annual military budget. The gold itself was important, but the psychological impact was even more significant. For the first time in its history, Rome was paying regular tribute to barbarian leaders, acknowledging that its military power was insufficient to protect its own territory without barbarian consent. Furthermore, Byzantium agreed to a series of additional concessions that effectively acknowledged Hunnic sovereignty over vast territories that had once been considered within the Roman sphere of influence. The empire agreed not to harbour fugitive prisoners or escaped slaves, to grant Hunnic merchants unrestricted access to imperial markets, and to pursue and punish any spies operating against the steppe confederations. Most significantly, Rome agreed to hand over the Bishop of Margus, who according to Hunnic accusations had crossed into their territory and desecrated the ancient royal burial grounds that held the bones of chieftains stretching back generations. This wasn't merely a political demand, but a sacred obligation, an insult to the ancestors that demanded blood atonement. The surrender of a high-ranking church official to barbarian justice sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. It demonstrated that the Roman Empire was willing to sacrifice even its spiritual leaders to maintain peace with the Huns, a precedent that would have far-reaching consequences for future negotiations. Priscus of Panium, the Byzantine ambassador who negotiated these terms, provided a rare and invaluable account of the proceedings. He wrote with evident surprise that the Huns' behaviour during the negotiations confounded Roman expectations. They were outwardly uncouth by imperial standards, wearing leather and furs rather than silk, eating with their hands rather than silver implements, but their diplomatic discourse was precise, logical, and devastatingly effective. Despite their nomadic lifestyle and apparent barbarism, they conducted business with a level of calculation and strategic thinking that would have impressed any imperial official. They had clearly studied Roman weaknesses with the same methodical attention that Roman generals devoted to planning military campaigns. Attila, though seated on a simple wooden chair rather than an ornate throne, dominated the proceedings through sheer force of personality. Priscus noted that he spoke infrequently but with devastating effect, and that his mere presence seemed to drain the confidence from the Roman negotiators. The treaty negotiations revealed another crucial aspect of Attila's character, his ability to project authority without relying on traditional symbols of power. He needed no crown, no purple robes, no elaborate ceremonial to command respect. His authority derived from a deeper source, the absolute confidence of a man who knew his own strength and felt no need to display it ostentatiously. The shadow of brotherhood. The peace established by the Treaty of Margus proved to be exactly what Attila had intended. Not an end to conflict, but a breathing space that allowed the Huns to consolidate their position while draining Roman resources. Just 2 years later, Hunnic raiders launched renewed attacks into Thrace and Moesia, striking with a coordination and strategic purpose that made clear these were not random raids driven by greed. This was a deliberate strategy of pressure, designed to demonstrate to the Roman world that peace had a price that must be paid continuously. The goal wasn't immediate conquest. Attila understood that the empire was too vast to be swallowed whole, but rather a systematic erosion of Roman authority and self-confidence. The campaign was orchestrated with mathematical precision. Rather than launching massive assaults that would unite Roman resistance, the Huns employed a strategy of persistent low-level pressure that kept their enemies off balance and prevented any effective counterattack. Small forces would appear suddenly at multiple points along the frontier, strike quickly at carefully selected targets, and vanish before Roman forces could respond. Each raid served multiple purposes: gathering intelligence about Roman defensive capabilities, capturing prisoners who could provide valuable information, seizing portable wealth that could finance future operations, and most importantly, maintaining psychological pressure on the civilian population. The message was clear: Roman protection was an illusion, and safety could only be purchased through submission to Hunnic demands. In 443 and 444, Hunnic detachments appeared suddenly before the walls of major cities, demanding ransom payments and further political concessions. The empire, already strained by conflicts on multiple frontiers and internal political disputes, found itself forced to accede to these demands repeatedly. The pattern was always the same. A Hunnic force would appear without warning, present specific demands with tight deadlines, and withdraw if their terms were met promptly. Resistance resulted in immediate escalation, with reinforcements appearing as if from nowhere to overwhelm any opposition. The speed and coordination of these operations convinced many Romans that they were facing an enemy with supernatural powers. The annual tribute was increased to 1,000 pounds of gold, a sum equivalent to the entire annual salary of a Roman legion. To put this in perspective, it represented enough wealth to purchase 50,000 horses or maintain a private army of 10,000 men for an entire year. The economic impact on the already struggling Eastern Empire was devastating, but the gold was only part of the cost. Each payment reinforced the psychological reality that Rome was now a client state of the Hunnic Confederation, dependent on barbarian goodwill for its continued existence. This shift in the balance of power encouraged other barbarian peoples to reconsider their own relationships with imperial authority. During these years of external success, Attila and Bleda continued to expand and refine the internal structure of their confederation. Under their joint leadership served not only the various Hunnic clans, but an increasingly diverse collection of peoples: Ostrogoths fleeing Visigothic expansion, Gepids seeking protection from Roman punitive expeditions, various Slavic tribes, displaced by demographic pressures, Sarmatians driven from their traditional lands, and Bulgars whose own nomadic wanderings had brought them into the Hunnic sphere. Each group retained its distinctive culture, language, and religious practices, but all were bound by common obligations: to provide warriors when called upon, to pay tribute according to their means, and to acknowledge the supreme authority of the two Hunnic rulers. This multicultural military confederation represented something unprecedented in European history: a barbarian empire that governed through integration rather than suppression. The administrative challenges of managing such a diverse coalition required innovations that went far beyond traditional nomadic governance. Different peoples had different military traditions, different concepts of honor and obligation, different religious beliefs that might conflict with each other. Creating unity from this diversity required diplomatic skills of the highest order. Attila proved particularly adept at this type of cultural diplomacy. He made it a point to learn at least basic phrases in the languages of all major subject peoples, to understand their religious customs well enough to avoid giving offense, and to identify local leaders who could serve as intermediaries between their people and Hunnic authority. Within the power structure itself, a subtle but significant redistribution of influence began to occur. Though the brothers formally continued to rule as equals, increasingly the major initiatives and strategic decisions originated with Attila. He was the one who established direct diplomatic contact with Byzantine officials, who dispatched embassies to distant tribes, and who formed the personal guard of elite warriors drawn from all the subject peoples. His words began to carry more weight in tribal councils, his name to resonate more widely among both allies and enemies. Bleda remained actively involved in leadership and showed no signs of open resentment toward his brother's growing prominence. But among the council of elders and tribal chieftains, few doubted which of the two brothers possessed the longer strategic vision. The relationship between the brothers during this period appears to have been genuinely collaborative, with each contributing his particular strengths to their common enterprise. However, the very nature of barbarian politics made such arrangements inherently unstable. Ultimate authority could not be permanently divided. Eventually, circumstances would arise that would require unified command and clear hierarchy. Priscus, during his diplomatic mission to the Hunnic court, was granted the extraordinary privilege of observing their headquarters firsthand. He described a setting that contradicted Roman expectations of barbarian excess. Wooden houses rather than stone palaces, carpets of rough fabric rather than silk and gold thread, warriors sitting cross-legged on the ground rather than reclining on couches. The simplicity was deliberate, reflecting step values that equated luxury with weakness and ostentation with insecurity. A leader who needed elaborate displays to command respect was, by definition, not truly worthy of leadership. True authority required no external validation. It was evident in every word and gesture. He noted particularly that Attila wore plain woolen clothing without ornamental metalwork, ate the same simple foods as his warriors, and tolerated no displays of luxury or ostentation in his presence. And yet, Priscus wrote, every gesture of this plainly dressed man commanded immediate silence, and he was listened to with rapt attention, even when he chose to remain silent. The contrast with Roman imperial ceremonies could not have been more stark. Where Roman emperors surrounded themselves with elaborate protocol designed to emphasize their separation from ordinary humanity, Attila's authority derived from his obvious superiority within a context of apparent equality. His followers obeyed him not because tradition demanded it, but because they recognized his exceptional capabilities. The final reckoning. This was a time of careful formation, when two brothers held in their hands a confederation that was fragile despite its growing power. It was a period when the Huns ceased to be merely another nomadic tribe and began to transform into something approaching a true state, capable not just of raiding and plundering, but of conducting sophisticated diplomacy and long-term strategic planning. It was also a time when one of the brothers had already begun to rise above the other, not through open rivalry or fraternal conflict, but through the gradual recognition of superior vision and capability. The steppe peoples, accustomed to following strength wherever they found it, began almost unconsciously to look toward Attila as the ultimate source of authority. The transition was so gradual that it seemed almost natural when it finally occurred. Tribal delegations increasingly directed their reports and requests to Attila personally, even when Bleda was present. Foreign ambassadors found themselves conducting their most important negotiations with the younger brother, while Bleda's role gradually shifted towards ceremonial functions and internal administration. This shift in influence was reflected in the composition of the brothers' personal retinues. Attila's bodyguard expanded to include the most capable warriors from all the confederated tribes, men chosen not for their tribal connections but for their individual skills and absolute loyalty to his person. These warriors became the nucleus of what would later evolve into an imperial guard of unprecedented effectiveness. Bleda, brother and co-ruler of the Hunnic Union, vanished from the chronicles as suddenly as morning mist before the sun. This occurred sometime in the mid-440s, during the height of their joint success against the Roman Empire. No written record preserves the exact date, the specific circumstances, or even absolute certainty that he met a violent end. Roman writers, always eager for details about barbarian internecine strife, merely note in passing that Attila became sole ruler after his brother's death. Byzantine chroniclers, among whom Priscus of Panium stands out as the most reliable, report only rumours and whispered speculation about what had transpired in the felt tents of the royal encampment. The lack of detailed accounts is itself significant. In a culture where great deeds and dramatic events were typically preserved in oral tradition and sung around campfires for generations, the silence surrounding Bleda's disappearance suggests something that the tribal elders preferred not to commemorate or discuss. No grand funeral pyre lit the steppe sky. No formal period of mourning was declared. No elaborate burial mound was raised to mark the passing of a great chief. Some whispered of a hunting accident in the forests north of the Danube, where wild boar were known to charge wounded hunters. Others spoke of a drunken brawl that had escalated beyond control, ending with steel rather than words. A few dared to suggest more direct involvement by Attila himself, though none possessed evidence beyond suspicion and political calculation. What no one could deny was the profound significance of Bleda's absence from the careful balance of power that had characterized Hunnic leadership for nearly a decade. The manner of Bleda's disappearance, sudden, unexplained, and followed by his brother's immediate assumption of sole authority, established a precedent that would influence steppe politics for generations. It demonstrated that even the closest family bonds could not override the demands of political necessity, and that ultimate power could not be permanently shared without eventual conflict. The consolidation of absolute power. The initial months of Attila's sole rule defied every expectation held by Roman observers and Hunnic subordinates alike. There was no bloodbath, no wholesale purge of Bleda's supporters, no dramatic overturning of existing policies and alliances. The intricate power structures that the brothers had built together remained largely intact, functioning with the same efficiency that had made them so formidable. Existing alliances with subject tribes were honoured, territorial agreements were respected, and tribal elders retained their traditional positions and privileges, even those who had been known to favour Bleda's more impulsive approach to leadership. It was a calculated demonstration of continuity, the political equivalent of a master swordsman who kills with a single precise thrust rather than wild slashing. But this apparent calm was deceptive, the eye of a gathering storm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Attila began to consolidate his personal authority in ways that would have been impossible under the dual leadership arrangement. The changes were so gradual that they seemed like natural evolution rather than deliberate revolution. Messengers bearing gifts and carefully worded commands travelled to tribal chieftains across the Confederation, subtly reminding them where ultimate loyalty was expected to lie. The gifts were chosen with symbolic precision: weapons for warriors, horses for chiefs who prized mobility, precious stones for leaders who understood the value of portable wealth. Those who had maintained cautious distance during the period of shared rule found themselves summoned to court, offered positions of influence and responsibility that bound them more closely to Attila's person. He understood intuitively the power of proximity, that men who attended his daily councils, who shared his meals and witnessed his decision-making process, would gradually transfer their primary allegiance from their own tribes to his personal authority. One of the most significant changes occurred within his personal guard, the elite corps of warriors who served as both military unit and political symbol. Previously drawn primarily from his own clan and closely related tribal groups, this force was systematically expanded to include carefully selected warriors from the Gepids, Alans, Goths, and other subject peoples. But these weren't merely mercenaries serving for pay, nor hostages held to ensure tribal loyalty. These men underwent a formal ceremony in which they swore personal allegiance directly to Attila himself, an oath that explicitly superseded their birth loyalties to tribe and clan. This was the seed of what would later be recognized as a truly supranational power structure. The implications were revolutionary for a nomadic culture built on kinship ties and tribal identity. For the first time in steppe history, warriors were bound to a leader not by blood or traditional obligation, but by personal choice and individual loyalty. It was a transformation that would profoundly influence later nomadic empires, from the Mongols to the Turks. The ceremony itself was designed to emphasize the magnitude of the commitment being made. New members of the Guard were required to undergo ritual scarification that marked them permanently as Attila's men, to surrender their tribal insignia in favour of new symbols that proclaimed their allegiance to him alone, and to participate in sacred oaths that could only be dissolved by death. The tribal councils continued to meet according to ancient custom, but their character changed fundamentally. Gone were the heated debates and lengthy arguments that had characterized traditional steppe politics. Now the elders listened while Attila spoke, offering advice when asked but never presuming to challenge his ultimate authority. He was patient with their deliberations, never interrupting their discussions or showing visible irritation with their concerns. But when he finally spoke, his word was understood to be final. He didn't need to proclaim himself king or demand divine honours. His power rested on the unshakable foundation of demonstrated competence and unchallenged will. The transformation in council procedures reflected a broader change in the nature of Hunnic governance. What had been a traditional tribal confederation based on consensus and mutual obligation was evolving into something more closely resembling an autocratic empire, with Attila as the sole source of ultimate authority. Around this time, the rudiments of a permanent central administration began to take concrete form. A sprawling headquarters complex was established in Pannonia, strategically positioned along the Tisa River, where it could control the flow of trade and military movement between the steppes and the civilized world. No massive stone fortifications were erected. Such construction would have been alien to nomadic sensibilities, but rather an extensive network of wooden buildings that housed the growing apparatus of empire. There were workshops where captured craftsmen laboured to produce weapons and armour, vast storehouses where tribute and plunder accumulated, reception halls where foreign ambassadors waited for audiences, and private chambers where the most sensitive political decisions were made. The workshops represented a significant departure from traditional nomadic practices. Instead of relying entirely on captured or traded goods, the Huns were now producing their own military equipment, incorporating innovations learned from Roman engineers and Gothic metalworkers. This self-sufficiency was crucial for maintaining independence from potential enemies who might attempt to control them through trade embargoes. One foreign envoy who visited this headquarters during Attila's consolidation of power left a detailed description that provides insight into his emerging style of leadership. He spoke little, but each word seemed to carry the weight of iron. He wore clothing as plain as any common warrior, yet no one present dared to look directly at him without permission. He shared his meals with his bodyguards, but they would not begin eating until he had tasted each dish. This combination of accessibility and awesome authority would become Attila's signature approach to leadership. He remained personally approachable to his followers, while simultaneously maintaining an aura of almost supernatural power that discouraged any thought of challenge or rebellion. The careful balance was maintained through a combination of genuine charisma and calculated intimidation. Attila possessed the rare ability to inspire both affection and terror in the same individuals, creating bonds of loyalty that transcended mere political calculation. His followers didn't obey him simply because they feared punishment. They obeyed because they genuinely believed in his superior judgment and leadership abilities. The web of influence. Attila understood intuitively that absolute control was impossible to maintain over the vast territories and diverse peoples under Hunnic dominance. The steppes themselves resisted rigid hierarchical organization, and the nomadic peoples would inevitably rebel against any system that felt too constraining or foreign to their traditional ways. But he also recognized that effective leadership required more than simple military dominance. If you couldn't rule through fear alone, and fear was ultimately a finite resource that diminished through familiarity, then you could rule through creating networks of mutual obligation that made rebellion practically impossible. He began systematically forging new bonds that transcended traditional tribal loyalties. Strategic marriages were arranged with calculated precision, offering his daughters and sisters to allied chieftains, while simultaneously taking wives from important families throughout the Confederation. These weren't romantic alliances, but political investments that created kinship ties radiating outward from his person. The marriage alliances served multiple purposes beyond simple diplomacy. They created hostages of sorts, family members whose safety depended on continued loyalty. They established communication channels that could carry information and influence across vast distances. Most importantly, they created emotional bonds that made betrayal feel like personal treachery rather than merely political opposition. The sons of tribal elders were invited to his court, ostensibly to receive education in statecraft and military leadership, but in reality serving as high-status hostages whose presence ensured their father's continued loyalty. These young men were treated with honor and given real responsibilities, making their hostage status feel more like privilege than constraint. The education these young hostages received was comprehensive and carefully designed. They learned Hunnic military tactics and administrative procedures, but they also absorbed Attila's worldview and strategic thinking. When they eventually returned to their home tribes, they carried with them not only fond memories of their time at court, but a deep understanding of Hunnic capabilities and a personal connection to Attila himself. Through such methods, Attila created an invisible web of influence that bound tribal leaders through overlapping obligations of duty, fear, ambition, and genuine affection. A chieftain might consider rebellion, but would hesitate when he remembered that his son served in Attila's personal guard, his daughter was married to one of Attila's cousins, and his own wife had been chosen for him by Attila's recommendation. The system was self-reinforcing. Success brought rewards that made continued loyalty more attractive than the risks of rebellion. Those who served faithfully received preferential treatment in the distribution of plunder, priority access to the best grazing lands, and protection from enemies who might otherwise threaten their independence. Among Attila's inner circle, new figures began to emerge, men whose names would soon become known across the civilized world, though rarely with affection. These were not merely advisors offering counsel, but active executors of imperial policy, men who acted swiftly, silently, and with devastating effectiveness when Attila's will required implementation. One such figure was Orestes, a Roman-born administrator who'd been captured in childhood and raised within the Hunnic court. His unique background, Roman education combined with Hunnic loyalty, made him invaluable for conducting negotiations with imperial officials, who might underestimate a purely barbarian negotiator. Another was Onegesius, a Hun of noble birth who possessed an unusual combination of military prowess and diplomatic skill. He served as Attila's primary liaison with the various Germanic tribes that had been incorporated into the Confederation, understanding both their traditional customs and their evolving relationship with Hunnic authority. Through these carefully chosen lieutenants, Attila maintained personal control over every aspect of the Confederation's operation: military logistics, intelligence gathering, diplomatic negotiations, tribute collection, and the complex web of alliances that held the entire structure together. He might not have possessed the ability to read or write. Literacy was rare among nomadic peoples, but his memory was legendary, capable of recalling who had promised what, who had paid tribute on time, who had been late, and who had attempted to deceive him. This personal approach to governance was both a strength and a potential weakness. It allowed for incredible flexibility and responsiveness to changing circumstances, but it also made the entire system dependent on Attila's continued health and mental capacity. The Confederation was not an institution that could survive the loss of its creator. It was an extension of his personal will and authority. The intelligence network that Attila developed during this period was perhaps his most important innovation. Unlike the Romans, who relied heavily on written reports and formal military reconnaissance, the Huns created a system based on personal relationships and oral communication that was both more flexible and more secure. Merchants, refugees, deserters, captured prisoners, and diplomatic envoys all became sources of information about enemy capabilities and intentions. This intelligence was cross-checked through multiple sources and analysed by men who had spent years learning to distinguish reliable information from deliberate misinformation. The network extended far beyond the borders of the Confederation itself. Hunnic agents operated within Roman territory, Gothic kingdoms and Frankish territories, often disguised as traders or craftsmen. These agents gathered not only military intelligence, but information about political divisions, economic problems and social tensions that could be exploited during future campaigns. The instrument of divine wrath. By the late 440s, the transformation was complete. Attila had not merely survived his brother's mysterious disappearance, he had used it as an opportunity to build something entirely new. He was no longer simply a tribal leader commanding the loyalty of his kinsmen, but the architect of a vast political confederation that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. He didn't just command an army, he had become the beating heart and calculating brain of an entire civilization. No previous nomadic leader had wielded such complete influence over so many diverse peoples, or maintained such intricate control over such vast territories without the infrastructure of roads, cities, and written records that supported conventional empires. The achievement was all the more remarkable because it had been accomplished through personal authority rather than institutional structures. Attila's empire existed because he existed. His death would almost certainly mean its dissolution. This made him simultaneously more powerful than any conventional emperor and more vulnerable to the basic human limitations of mortality and physical capacity. He understood better than any of his contemporaries the crucial importance of perception in the exercise of power. Before striking at an enemy, he needed to ensure that his mere name would inspire the kind of paralyzing terror that made actual conquest unnecessary. Fear was his most potent weapon, more effective than any cavalry charge or siege engine. The titles by which he was known reflected this calculated cultivation of his fearsome reputation: Lord of the Huns, Master of the Steppes, Terror of the Frontiers, and most memorably, Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. This last title was particularly significant, suggesting divine sanction for his campaigns of destruction and conquest. The title, Scourge of God, was not one that Attila claimed for himself, but rather one that emerged from the desperate attempts of his enemies to comprehend the disasters that befell them. To Christian observers, the systematic nature of Hunnic victories suggested supernatural intervention, and if God permitted such devastation, it must be as punishment for collective sins. Attila neither confirmed nor denied the divine implications of his title, understanding that ambiguity served his purposes better than explicit claims. If his enemies wished to believe that he was an instrument of divine wrath, such beliefs only enhanced his psychological authority. If they chose to see him as merely another barbarian chieftain, they would underestimate him to their cost. The reality was that Attila's power derived from very human sources: superior intelligence, better organization, more effective motivation of followers, and a clearer understanding of strategic objectives than any of his opponents possessed. But these mundane explanations were less satisfying to contemporary observers than supernatural theories, and Attila was content to let his enemies comfort themselves with whatever explanations helped them accept their defeats. Now, as undisputed master of the greatest nomadic confederation in European history, Attila was finally ready to reveal the full scope of his ambitions to a world that had grown complacent behind its walls and treaties. The phase of consolidation and preparation was complete. The time for direct confrontation with Roman power had arrived. The strategy of systematic terror, while Attila was methodically consolidating his power in the forests and grasslands of Pannonia, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to project an image of stability and enduring strength. The massive walls of Constantinople stood as defiant as ever, their stones still bearing the proud inscriptions of emperors who had believed their dominion would last forever. The golden domes of the capital's churches gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, visible from miles away to approaching travellers, while the vast bureaucratic machinery of imperial administration continued to churn out its endless stream of decrees, reports, tax assessments, and judicial pronouncements. The rhythm of imperial life seemed as eternal and unchanging as the tides, but this impressive facade concealed a reality of increasing fragility and systemic decay. Beyond the capital's immediate environs, the provinces languished under the crushing weight of taxation required to fund both the military and the bloated civil service. Roads that had once carried the traffic of empire crumbled from neglect, their maintenance deferred year after year as resources were diverted to more immediate crises. The breakdown of infrastructure had profound consequences for imperial unity and defensive capability. Communication between distant provinces became slower and less reliable, making coordinated responses to threats increasingly difficult. Trade declined as merchants found it cheaper to risk barbarian raids than to pay the bribes and taxes required for official protection. Tax collection became increasingly difficult as prosperity declined, and local populations fled to avoid the imperial collectors. Military garrisons were weakened by chronic shortages of both manpower and supplies, as the empire struggled to maintain forces on multiple threatened frontiers simultaneously. Desertion rates climbed as soldiers went months without pay, and equipment deteriorated beyond effective use. Most ominously, the loyalty of the army itself was becoming questionable. Many units were composed largely of barbarian federates whose ultimate allegiance was uncertain, while even Roman troops showed disturbing tendencies to support regional commanders against central authority when their immediate interests were threatened. It was against this backdrop of imperial weakness disguised as strength that Attila began to implement his most ambitious strategic vision. He didn't launch the kind of sudden, overwhelming assault that characterized traditional barbarian attacks on Roman territory. Such an approach might achieve short-term tactical success, but it would also unite the empire's remaining strength in resistance. Instead, his strategy was ruthlessly methodical, designed to exploit Roman weaknesses while avoiding their remaining strengths. Rather than hurling his entire army against the heavily fortified frontier regions, he began with an extensive intelligence-gathering operation that would have impressed any Roman spy master. The intelligence phase lasted nearly 2 years and involved hundreds of agents operating across the breadth of the Eastern Empire. These men gathered information that no Roman general possessed about the actual condition of imperial defences, the real state of garrison morale, and the true extent of provincial resources available for military purposes. Hunnic agents, disguised as merchants and travelling craftsmen, infiltrated the markets and workshops of frontier towns. They moved freely through the empire, their barbarian appearance arousing no particular suspicion in regions long accustomed to foreign traders. These men gathered detailed information about grain supplies, garrison strengths, the positions of watchtowers, the loyalty of local populations, and the efficiency of communication systems. But Attila's intelligence network sought more than mere military information. His agents mapped human weaknesses as carefully as geographical ones, identifying which officials could be bribed, which populations harboured grievances against imperial rule, and which local leaders might be turned into collaborators through the right combination of threats and rewards. The intelligence gathered during this phase revealed the shocking extent of imperial decay. Many frontier fortifications were undermanned and poorly supplied. Local commanders often had no effective communication with their superiors and were making defensive decisions based on outdated information. Civilian populations in border regions felt abandoned by a government that demanded taxes but provided little protection in return. Most importantly, the intelligence revealed deep divisions within Roman society that could be exploited during military operations. Religious disputes between Orthodox and heretical Christians, ethnic tensions between Roman and barbarian populations, economic conflicts between urban and rural interests. All of these represented potential vulnerabilities that a sophisticated enemy could manipulate. Around 441 AD, when this preliminary phase was complete, the first coordinated offensives began. The army that Attila assembled for these campaigns represented the full diversity of his confederation and the sophisticated integration he had achieved among formerly hostile peoples. Under his personal banner rode not only the traditional Hunnic cavalry that had made his people legendary, but also Alans renowned for their heavy cavalry charges, Gepids famous for their infantry tactics, Ostrogoths fleeing their Visigothic cousins, Avars seeking new lands, Bulgars driven by demographic pressure, and Sarmatians whose own nomadic traditions complemented Hunnic mobility. The exact numbers of this polyglot army remain unknown, as barbarian peoples didn't maintain the kind of detailed military records that characterized Roman legions. Byzantine chroniclers, writing from second-hand accounts and often influenced by propaganda considerations, spoke vaguely of tens of thousands of horsemen, but modern estimates suggest the force may have numbered between 60 and 80,000 warriors. What made this army truly formidable wasn't merely its size, but its revolutionary approach to military logistics and tactical coordination. Unlike traditional barbarian war bands that relied on plunder for supplies and dissolved when immediate objectives were achieved, Attila's force operated with the discipline and sustainability of a professional military organization. Its defining characteristic was speed, not just in battle, but in campaign mobility that redefined the strategic possibilities of warfare. Advanced cavalry units could cover distances in days that would require weeks for traditional Roman legions burdened with their extensive baggage trains and siege equipment. They needed no paved roads, waited for no supply convoys, lived off the land through a combination of foraging and rapid requisition from local populations, and moved with the kind of relentless purpose that came from unified command and shared objectives. The psychological impact of this mobility was as important as its tactical advantages. Enemies could never predict where the Huns would appear next, making defence planning virtually impossible. The first wave of attacks swept through the Roman province of Illyricum like a grass fire driven by steppe winds. Hunnic armies descended on villages, burned strategic warehouses, captured or killed local officials, and systematically rounded up prisoners for ransom or slavery. But there was an underlying system to what appeared to be random destruction. Attila had studied Roman administrative methods with the same careful attention he devoted to military tactics. He understood that the empire's strength lay not just in its armies, but in its ability to extract resources from subject populations and maintain communication between distant provinces. His attacks were designed to sever these connections and demonstrate the imperial government's inability to protect its own people. The targeting was precise and purposeful. Hunnic forces struck at tax collection centres, destroyed military supply depots, burned bridges and river crossings, and captured or killed imperial officials responsible for maintaining local administration. Each attack was calculated to maximise the disruption of imperial functions while minimising the risks to Hunnic forces. One particularly significant target was the city of Naissus, modern-day Niš in Serbia, a major administrative centre that controlled several crucial road junctions. The city was captured after a brief siege, partially plundered according to steppe custom, and its surviving inhabitants driven out with explicit instructions to flee to other urban centres. This wasn't an act of simple destruction, but a calculated act of psychological warfare. The refugees carried with them not just news of Hunnic military success, but detailed, terrifying accounts of what they had witnessed. These eyewitness reports spread far more rapidly than any official imperial communications, creating a wave of panic that preceded Attila's actual military advance. The psychological impact was multiplied by the deliberate cruelty that characterized Hunnic occupation of captured territories. Prisoners were treated according to their potential value. Those with useful skills or high ransom potential were preserved, while others faced slavery or death. The arbitrary nature of these decisions created additional terror among civilian populations who could never predict their fate if captured. The Empire of Fear, the capture of Naissus, wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated campaign that demonstrated Attila's sophisticated understanding of how to wage war against a civilization rather than merely against its armies. Across the provinces of Thrace and Moesia, Hunnic detachments appeared with terrifying suddenness, struck with devastating effectiveness, and vanished back into the wilderness before any coordinated Roman response could be organised. Their primary objective wasn't territorial conquest in the traditional sense. Attila had no intention of occupying and administering Roman provinces, but rather the systematic erosion of imperial authority and the psychological confidence that supported it. He wanted the empire to feel its fundamental inability to protect its own territory and population. The campaign demonstrated innovations in military organisation that would influence warfare for centuries to come. Rather than moving as a single massive army that could be tracked and confronted, Attila's forces operated as multiple independent columns that could converge rapidly when concentration was needed or disperse when faced with superior opposition. Each column was self-sufficient and capable of independent action, but all were coordinated through a communication system based on mounted messengers who could cover vast distances at speeds that amazed contemporary observers. This allowed for complex operations involving simultaneous attacks at multiple locations, creating the impression of Hunnic omnipresence. The Huns extracted massive ransom payments from wealthy cities, destroyed strategically important supply depots and weapons manufactories, ruined agricultural areas during crucial harvest periods, and then disappeared into the vast spaces beyond. Roman control leaving behind a void where imperial authority had once existed. The empire found itself in the impossible position of being unable to strike back at enemies who could appear anywhere and vanish before retaliation was possible. More significantly, it became clear that the imperial government could neither predict where Attila would strike next, nor prevent him from striking wherever he chose. This unpredictability was one of Attila's most effective weapons. Roman defensive planning depended on the ability to anticipate enemy movements and concentrate forces at threatened points. When the enemy could appear anywhere at any time, such planning became impossible, and defenders were forced to spread their limited resources across vast areas, making them vulnerable everywhere. A chilling report reached the Byzantine Senate during the spring of 442 AD, written by a provincial governor whose territory had been repeatedly raided. "Our enemies do not seek battle in the traditional manner," he wrote with obvious frustration. "They seek rather to implant the memory of fear. They are not interested in decisive victory, but in maintaining a presence that renders our authority meaningless." This was an astute observation that captured the essence of Attila's revolutionary approach to warfare. He wasn't seeking the kind of climactic confrontation that would allow Roman military superiority to assert itself. Instead, he sought to bleed the empire slowly, with gold, with terror, with the constant demand for attention and resources that could never be relaxed. The economic impact of Hunnic operations extended far beyond the immediate costs of ransom payments and destroyed property. Commerce throughout the affected regions ground to a halt as merchants refused to risk their goods on roads that couldn't be protected. Agricultural production declined as farmers abandoned fields that might be raided during harvest season. Urban populations began to flee to areas that seemed safer, creating refugee crises that strained the resources of unaffected regions. Tax collection became impossible in many areas, reducing imperial revenues precisely when military expenses were reaching unprecedented levels. The cumulative effect was a downward spiral of weakness that fed on itself. In one incident that became legendary throughout the empire, Attila dispatched an embassy to an unnamed city, whose chroniclers failed to record its identity, perhaps from shame at what transpired. The Hunnic delegation entered through the city gates not as conquerors, but as diplomatic representatives, carrying with them a single item to present to the municipal authorities. This gift was a whip, its handle wrapped in silver wire and its leather thongs dyed the deep red of fresh blood. When the city's elders questioned the meaning of this ominous present, the Hun ambassadors offered no explanation beyond a simple statement that became part of imperial folklore. "If you do not wish to pay with gold, you will pay with this." The psychological impact was devastating. The city surrendered immediately, paid the demanded tribute in full, and the Hunnic embassy departed without their warriors even needing to enter the city proper. This incident was reported throughout the eastern provinces, transforming Attila's name from merely a military threat into a symbol of inevitable subjugation. The story spread because it perfectly encapsulated the new reality that Roman populations were struggling to comprehend. Their empire, which had once seemed eternal and invincible, was now at the mercy of barbarian whims. Safety could no longer be guaranteed by walls or armies, but only by submission to demands that might arrive without warning from enemies who remained invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. But this systematic campaign of terror wasn't merely about extracting immediate payment or causing random destruction. Attila was carefully observing the consequences of his actions, studying how the empire responded to pressure, and learning where its remaining strengths and weaknesses lay. He understood that a thoroughly pillaged city would drive away the merchants whose activity generated tax revenue, that burned villages would eliminate the agricultural surplus needed to feed urban populations, and that fleeing peasants would leave. No one available to maintain the complex irrigation systems and road networks that kept the imperial machinery functioning. His true target wasn't the Roman army, which remained formidable when properly concentrated and commanded, but rather the entire concept of stable, predictable governance that made civilized life possible. He was waging war not just against Roman military power, but against the fundamental assumptions that supported urban civilization itself. The master of calculated destruction, within the Hunnic camp during these campaigns, a phenomenon that surprised many Roman observers, was the level of discipline and organization that characterized what they had expected to be a typical barbarian. Horde. According to Priscus, who would later have the opportunity to observe Attila's military organization firsthand, every warrior knew his place in the hierarchy, and disobedience was punished with swift severity. Theft from fellow warriors was met with summary execution, insubordination toward commanders resulted in immediate expulsion from the army, and failure to maintain equipment or horses brought loss of warrior status. Military units marched in organized formations, arrived at designated positions precisely on schedule, and maintained camp discipline that would have impressed a Roman centurion. The contrast with traditional barbarian military organisation was striking. Most tribal war bands were essentially armed mobs, held together by personal loyalty to a charismatic leader, and motivated primarily by the prospect of immediate plunder. They were effective for short-term raids but lacked the staying power for sustained campaigns. Attila's army was different. It was organised into units with clear chains of command, standardised equipment and training, and logistical support systems that allowed for extended operations far from friendly territory. This transformation from tribal warband to professional military force represented one of Attila's most significant achievements. They possessed no written laws, Priscus observed with evident amazement, but they maintained order through systems of personal obligation and shared understanding. They recorded no decisions in writing, yet no one forgot their responsibilities or failed to fulfill their assigned duties. This oral system of command and control was actually more flexible and responsive than the written procedures that characterized Roman military administration. Changes in orders could be transmitted instantly through the chain of command, while the personal relationships that bound the system together ensured that instructions were understood and implemented according to their spirit rather than merely their letter. This army wasn't managed through the constant shouting and physical coercion that characterized many barbarian warbands, but rather through a sophisticated system of personal loyalty that radiated outward from Attila himself. He had cultivated a cadre of devoted commanders, each responsible not only for the military effectiveness of their units, but also for maintaining morale and ensuring absolute compliance with orders. These commanders were deliberately chosen from different tribal backgrounds, a technique that Attila employed to maintain his own supreme authority. He placed men who distrusted each other but trusted him completely in positions where they had to cooperate to succeed. This prevented the formation of rival power centres, while ensuring that information about potential threats reached him through multiple independent channels. The selection process for these commanders was rigorous and ongoing. Attila constantly evaluated the performance of his subordinates, promoting those who showed exceptional ability while quietly removing those who failed to meet his standards. This created an atmosphere of competitive excellence that drove all his officers to perform at their highest level. It was during this period that Byzantine chroniclers began referring to Attila as Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God, an expression that would later become permanently associated with his name in historical memory. The exact origin of this title remains uncertain, as it appears simultaneously in multiple sources without clear attribution. Perhaps it arose spontaneously among Christian populations seeking to comprehend the disasters befalling the empire as divine punishment for collective sins. Perhaps it was deliberately promoted by church authorities who found religious explanations more palatable than admitting the superior military effectiveness of pagan barbarians. The title reflected the growing belief among Roman populations that they were facing something more than ordinary military conquest. The systematic nature of Hunnic victories, the apparent invincibility of their forces, and the precision of their strategic targeting suggested supernatural intervention in human affairs. But regardless of its origins, Attila didn't object to the title's implications. He never claimed divine status for himself, understanding that such pretensions would alienate his own followers, but he readily embraced the role of divine instrument if it enhanced his reputation for irresistible power. The psychological value of the title was enormous. Enemies who believed they were fighting against divine will were psychologically defeated before battle even began. The title also provided a useful explanation for Hunnic success that didn't require Roman leaders to admit their own incompetence or systemic weaknesses in imperial organization. Despite the vast scale and devastating effectiveness of his military campaigns, Attila demonstrated remarkable strategic patience. He didn't rush toward immediate conquest of major urban centers or attempt to occupy territory that he couldn't effectively control with his nomadic forces. Instead, he cultivated an image of inevitable threat, a force that could strike anywhere at any time, but chose not to out of calculated restraint rather than weakness. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, and the Roman Empire found itself losing a conflict in which no decisive battles had yet been fought. The restraint was strategic rather than humanitarian. Attila understood that premature attempts at territorial conquest would unite Roman resistance and force him into the kind of static warfare where imperial advantages in fortification and siege techniques could be brought to bear. As long as he remained mobile and unpredictable, the initiative remained entirely in his hands. The diplomacy of perpetual debt. When the immediate shock of military devastation had achieved its intended psychological impact, Attila demonstrated his understanding that the most effective conquests were often accomplished through negotiation, rather than continued bloodshed. The transition from warfare to diplomacy represented not a change in objectives, but simply a shift in tactics designed to achieve the same strategic goals. He understood better than most contemporary leaders that words coupled with the threat of violence were often more effective than violence itself. Diplomacy backed by demonstrated military capability could extract concessions that would have required years of costly warfare to achieve through force alone. Following the devastating raids that had swept through Thrace and Moesia, leaving a trail of burned cities and terrified populations, the Eastern Roman Empire found itself in the humiliating position of having to sue for peace with the very barbarians who had been systematically destroying its territory. The initiative for negotiations came from Constantinople, where Emperor Theodosius II and his advisors recognized that continued military resistance was both futile and economically disastrous. The imperial treasury was approaching bankruptcy from the costs of emergency military preparations, while the affected provinces were generating no tax revenue and required massive subsidies for reconstruction. The location chosen for negotiations was symbolic of the new balance of power. Margus, a fortified city located on the southern bank of the Danube, precisely at the frontier between Roman civilization and the barbarian world that Attila now dominated. The choice emphasized that the Romans were coming as supplicants to barbarian territory, rather than as equals meeting on neutral ground. The Byzantine delegation was led by experienced diplomats who understood they were dealing not with a simple tribal chieftain, but with a political and military genius who had fundamentally altered the strategic situation in Europe. The head of the delegation was Anatolius, a senior imperial official with decades of experience in barbarian negotiations, accompanied by Nomus, a military commander familiar with Hunnic tactical capabilities. Attila's demands, when finally presented, were both comprehensive and devastatingly precise. They reflected not the random greed of a successful raider, but the calculated requirements of a leader building a permanent power structure that could challenge the empire on equal terms. He required a substantial increase in the annual tribute payments that Byzantium had been making to various barbarian peoples, but with a crucial difference. These payments would now go directly to him personally, acknowledging his role as supreme authority over all the peoples beyond the Danube frontier. The tribute was set at £1,000 of gold annually, a sum that represented approximately 1/10 of the empire's total annual revenue. He demanded the immediate extradition of all fugitive Huns who had taken refuge within imperial territory, along with any Roman citizens of Hunnic ancestry who might be considered to owe allegiance to their ancestral homeland rather than to the emperor. This provision was designed to prevent the empire from harbouring potential dissidents who might threaten Hunnic internal security. He insisted on guaranteed duty-free trading privileges for Hunnic merchants throughout the empire, with the right to establish permanent commercial outposts in major urban centres. This would provide not only economic benefits, but also legitimate cover for the intelligence operations that were crucial to his military planning. Most controversially, he demanded the surrender of the Bishop of Margus, who according to Hunnic accusations had crossed into their territory and deliberately desecrated ancient royal burial grounds in search of treasure. This wasn't merely a political demand, but a sacred obligation, an insult to the ancestors that demanded blood atonement according to steppe law. The religious implications of this demand were profound. Christian bishops were considered sacred persons whose arrest or execution by pagan authorities represented not just political persecution, but spiritual warfare. The Church had developed elaborate theological justifications for martyrdom that made such sacrifices spiritually meaningful, even when they were politically disastrous. The Byzantine negotiators, desperate to avoid a renewal of the devastating raids, agreed to every demand without serious resistance. They even acquiesced to the surrender of the bishop, who was publicly handed over to Hunnic custody and subsequently executed without any formal trial. In this single act, the Eastern Roman Empire demonstrated that for the sake of temporary peace, it was willing to sacrifice not only treasure, but even its own religious officials. From that moment forward, the negotiations ceased to be between equals and became something closer to the dictation of terms by a victor to the defeated. Attila had crossed a psychological threshold that would profoundly influence all future relationships between his confederation and the civilized world. The precedent established by the bishop's surrender would have long-lasting consequences for church-state relationships throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. It demonstrated that political authorities were willing to sacrifice religious leaders when faced with sufficient external pressure, undermining the spiritual authority of the church and creating lasting tensions between secular and religious power. Under the final terms of what became known as the Treaty of Margus, Byzantium committed itself to paying the Huns an annual tribute of £1,000 of gold, a sum so vast that it required the reallocation of resources from other crucial imperial functions. The empire was also obligated to open trading posts along the entire length of the Danube frontier, to extradite all runaway slaves and military deserters, and most significantly, to formally recognise Hunnic territorial claims over all lands north of the Danube. In return, Attila pledged not to cross the great river with hostile intent, but this promise was carefully worded to preserve maximum flexibility for future action. He committed himself not to attack as long as the tribute continued to flow, and the other treaty obligations were scrupulously observed, but any failure on the Roman part would automatically void his restraint. The economic impact of the tribute payments was staggering. To put the £1,000 of gold in perspective, it represented more wealth than many provincial governors would see in their entire careers. The sum was sufficient to maintain a full legion for an entire year, or to purchase enough grain to feed a major city through a harsh winter. The gold had to be collected through special taxes levied on populations already strained by the costs of war and reconstruction. These emergency levies created widespread resentment among taxpayers who felt they were being forced to subsidize their own enemies. The psychological impact was as damaging as the economic burden. The empire was paying barbarians not to destroy Roman territory, a humiliation that contradicted everything Romans believed about their civilization's inherent superiority. The last Roman, while Attila was systematically extracting these humiliating concessions from the Eastern Empire, one man in the distant West understood better than any of his contemporaries the true nature of the threat that was emerging from the young steppes. His name was Flavius Aetius, and history would remember him as the last of the Romans, the final representative of the old imperial virtues in an age when the empire itself was dissolving. Aetius possessed a unique qualification for understanding Hunnic capabilities. In his youth, he had spent several crucial years among them as a high-status hostage, part of a diplomatic arrangement between Rome and the various barbarian peoples. Beyond the frontiers, this experience had given him insights into nomadic culture and military methods that no other Roman leader possessed. The circumstances of his hostage years had been typical of the complex relationships between Rome and the barbarian peoples. His father, Gaudentius, had been a Roman military commander of barbarian ancestry, who had maintained close ties with various tribal leaders as part of his official duties. When political circumstances required a demonstration of Roman good faith, young Aetius had been offered as a guarantee of imperial intentions. He had learned their language, participated in their hunts and raids, observed their political councils, and even fought alongside Hunnic warriors in campaigns against mutual enemies. This wasn't merely academic knowledge gained from books or reports, but practical understanding earned through personal experience of how these people thought, fought, and made decisions. The experience had been transformative in ways that went far beyond military education. Aetius had witnessed firsthand the strengths and weaknesses of nomadic society, observed the personal qualities that commanded respect among warriors, and learned to think strategically about problems that couldn't be solved through conventional Roman approaches. Most importantly, he had developed personal relationships with many of the men who now served under Attila's command. He knew their individual personalities, understood their motivations and loyalties, and could predict their likely responses to different tactical situations. This personal knowledge would prove invaluable when diplomatic and military confrontation became inevitable. Through this intimate exposure, Aetius understood that the Huns represented something fundamentally different from the various Germanic tribes that Rome had been fighting for centuries. They weren't simply another collection of warriors seeking plunder or land for settlement, but rather a disciplined military organization led by a strategic genius who had clear political objectives extending far beyond immediate tactical success. He recognized that the gold Attila was now extracting from Byzantium wouldn't be squandered on personal luxury or distributed as random rewards to followers, but would instead be carefully accumulated and invested in building the infrastructure necessary for even more ambitious campaigns. Every pound of Roman gold that flowed north across the Danube was effectively financing the construction of a war machine designed to destroy the civilization that had created that wealth. The relationship between Aetius and Attila was complex and fraught with mutual respect and inevitable antagonism. There was no personal hostility between them. Indeed, their correspondence suggests a degree of professional appreciation for each other's capabilities, but both men understood with perfect clarity that they were destined for eventual confrontation. The letters that passed between them during these years were masterpieces of diplomatic communication, brief communications that crackled with tension beneath their superficially polite language. Each man was testing the other, probing for weaknesses while demonstrating his own strength and resolve. On one occasion, Attila wrote with characteristic directness, "Have you forgotten what I taught you in your youth about the nature of power? You understand what approaches, and you know that walls built by other men will not protect you from what you learned in my father's tent." The message was clear. Attila was reminding Aetius that he possessed intimate knowledge of Roman weaknesses. From his time as a hostage, just as Aetius understood Hunnic capabilities from his own captivity, it was a subtle threat wrapped in the language of shared experience, warning that past friendship would not prevent future conflict. Aetius, displaying the Roman preference for action over rhetoric, sent no written reply to this challenge. Instead, he began the systematic construction of the military and political alliances that would be necessary to confront the Hunnic threat when diplomacy finally failed and armed conflict became inevitable. He strengthened existing treaties with various barbarian federates who had settled within Roman territory, offering them additional privileges and autonomy in exchange for guaranteed military service when required. These negotiations were delicate, as many of these peoples had historical ties to the Huns and might be tempted to switch sides if circumstances changed. He reinforced the garrison forces protecting Gaul, drawing troops from less threatened frontiers and concentrating them in positions where they could respond rapidly to invasion. This redeployment was controversial, as it left other regions more vulnerable to different threats, but Aetius understood that the Hunnic danger overshadowed all other concerns. Most crucially, he began gathering detailed intelligence about Hunnic military capabilities, organization, and strategic planning. His agents, many of them former hostages like himself who possessed the linguistic and cultural knowledge necessary to operate in barbarian territory, provided a steady stream of information about Attila's growing strength and expanding ambitions. The intelligence picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Attila's confederation was larger and better organized than Roman officials had realized. His military capabilities were expanding rapidly, and his strategic objectives clearly included the conquest of Roman territory in Gaul, and possibly Italy itself. The price of imperial weakness. For several years, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to make its humiliating tribute payments, while desperately hoping that this would satisfy Attila's ambitions and purchase lasting peace. Some officials in Constantinople convinced themselves that the annual £1,000 of gold represented a reasonable price for security, especially when compared to the costs of maintaining military forces capable of defending the lengthy Danube. Frontier. This self-deception was understandable but ultimately catastrophic. The tribute payments were indeed less expensive than full-scale military preparations, but they were also financing the very enemy forces that would eventually make such preparations necessary. Every payment made Attila stronger while making Roman resistance more difficult. But Attila viewed each payment not as a commercial transaction or a diplomatic accommodation, but as an acknowledgement of Roman submission to his authority. Every delivery of tribute reinforced his understanding that the empire could be pressured indefinitely, that its leaders lacked the will for sustained resistance, and that further demands would likely be met with the same reluctant compliance. The psychological dynamics were devastating for imperial prestige and self-confidence. An empire that had once dictated terms to kings and tribes across 3 continents now found itself paying protection money to a barbarian chieftain whose grandfather had been unknown beyond the steppes. The humiliation was compounded by the transparent nature of the arrangement. Unlike traditional diplomatic subsidies that could be disguised as alliance payments or commercial agreements, the Hunnic tribute was clearly extortion. Gold paid to prevent destruction, rather than to secure cooperation. This reality was understood by everyone involved, from the imperial court to the provincial populations who ultimately bore the cost. Whenever the tribute payments were delayed by administrative complications or Byzantine attempts to renegotiate terms, Attila responded with immediate and targeted military pressure. Hunnic raiders would appear at carefully chosen locations, inflict precisely calculated damage, and withdraw before effective resistance could be organised, leaving behind a clear message about the consequences of failing to meet obligations. These punitive expeditions were models of surgical warfare, designed to remind the empire of its vulnerability without triggering the kind of massive Roman mobilization that might threaten Hunnic advantages. The raids typically targeted locations of symbolic importance rather than military value, administrative centers, religious sites, or wealthy estates whose destruction would generate maximum psychological impact. The precision of these operations demonstrated the quality of Hunnic intelligence and the sophistication of their strategic planning. They could strike exactly where and when they intended, achieving their objectives with minimal risk to their own forces while maximizing the pressure on Roman decision-makers. Simultaneously, Attila was building an extensive political network in the Western Empire, establishing contacts with various barbarian groups that had settled within Roman territory and cultivating relationships that might prove useful when he eventually turned his attention westward. Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, Alemanni all became subjects of his diplomatic attention. He studied their internal politics, their relationships with Roman authorities, their military capabilities, and their potential usefulness as either allies or targets in future campaigns. He didn't immediately threaten these peoples or attempt to subvert their existing arrangements with Rome, but rather observed and waited, gathering information that would inform his strategic planning when the time came for action. He understood that knowledge of enemy weaknesses was often more valuable than superior numbers or weapons. The Hunnic diplomatic network operated through multiple channels: formal embassies that conducted official business, merchant networks that gathered commercial and political intelligence, religious figures who could move freely across political boundaries, and refugees or deserters who possessed inside knowledge of their former allegiances. This information was carefully analysed and cross-referenced to build comprehensive pictures of potential allies and enemies. Attila's staff included specialists in the languages, customs, and politics of different peoples, allowing for sophisticated assessment of opportunities and threats across a vast geographical area. The Hunnic power base in Pannonia, meanwhile, continued its transformation into something approaching a true imperial capital. Gold flowed there from both halves of the divided Roman Empire, along with tribute from dozens of subject tribes and plunder from countless raids and expeditions. Captive artisans and craftsmen laboured to build fortifications, forge weapons, and create the material infrastructure necessary to support Attila's expanding ambitions. Ironically, much of what Rome surrendered in hopes of purchasing peace was immediately converted into the tools that would eventually be used against the empire itself. The workshops produced not only traditional nomadic weapons and equipment, but also siege engines, heavy armour, and specialised military technology adapted from Roman, Gothic, and other sources. This represented a significant evolution in Hunnic military capabilities, allowing them to conduct operations that would have been impossible for purely traditional nomadic forces. But the accumulation of wealth and resources was never Attila's ultimate objective. These were merely means to an end, instruments for achieving the psychological dominance that he understood to be the true foundation of lasting power. He craved not just Roman gold, but Roman acknowledgement of his supremacy, not just when he was actively ravaging their territory, but as a constant, unquestioned reality. He wanted his name to be synonymous with the concept of irresistible force, to be a figure whose displeasure could not be risked, and whose favour had to be constantly cultivated. When gold alone could no longer maintain this psychological ascendancy, when the mere threat of force was no longer sufficient to ensure compliance, then actual warfare would become necessary to reinforce the lesson of Hunnic supremacy. Therefore, when his power reached its absolute zenith in the early 450s, when his confederation encompassed virtually all of Central Europe and his treasury overflowed with Roman tribute, Attila finally led his vast army into the heart of the Western Roman Empire, targeting the rich provinces of Gaul, where the final test of strength between nomadic and civilized power would be decided. The Gallic Gambit. By the early 450s, the Hunnic Empire had reached its maximum territorial extent and organizational sophistication. Attila commanded not only his original Hunnic followers, but a vast confederation of formerly independent peoples, Ostrogoths seeking revenge against their Visigothic cousins, Gepids displaced by demographic pressures, various Slavic tribes drawn by. Promises of plunder, Bulgars and Alans whose own nomadic traditions complemented Hunnic mobility, and even some Germanic peoples who had concluded that alliance with the Huns offered better prospects than loyalty to Rome. What bound this polyglot force together was not shared culture, common language, or religious beliefs, but rather a combination of fear of Attila's displeasure and respect for his demonstrated ability to lead them to victory and wealth. It was an empire built on personal loyalty to a single individual, which made it enormously powerful in the short term, but potentially fragile if that central authority were ever challenged successfully. The diversity of the confederation was both a strength and a challenge. Different peoples brought different military specialties: Hunnic horse archery, Alan heavy cavalry, Gepid infantry tactics, Gothic siege warfare techniques. But they also brought different concepts of honour, different religious practices, and different political traditions that had to be carefully managed to prevent internal conflict. Attila's genius lay in his ability to weld these diverse elements into a unified fighting force without destroying the particular qualities that made each group valuable. He allowed his various allies to maintain their distinctive identities while ensuring that their loyalties ran ultimately to him rather than to their traditional leaders. Across the Alps in Italy, Flavius Aetius had spent years preparing for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. He understood that a direct assault on the Italian peninsula wasn't yet strategically advantageous for Attila. It was too close to the Eastern Empire, whose forces might intervene, and too difficult to supply for extended operations. Gaul, however, represented a perfect target. Politically fragmented, militarily weakened by years of civil strife, and geographically isolated from potential imperial reinforcement. If Attila could establish permanent control over the Gallic provinces, he would possess a base for future operations against both Italy and the wealthy territories of North Africa. The wealth of Gaul was legendary throughout the barbarian world. Its fertile agricultural lands produced grain surpluses that fed much of the Western Empire. Its workshops created luxury goods coveted from Britain to Constantinople, and its position at the crossroads of European trade routes generated enormous commercial revenues. Control of Gaul would provide Attila with resources that could support indefinite expansion of his military power. Moreover, Gaul's barbarian populations might prove receptive to Hunnic leadership. Many of the Germanic tribes that had settled there retained warrior traditions and political structures that were compatible with nomadic confederation systems. If these peoples could be won over through a combination of successful leadership and generous treatment, they might provide the foundation for a permanent barbarian empire in Western Europe. The opportunity that triggered Attila's invasion arose from an unexpected source within the imperial family itself. Honoria, sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, had been convicted of conducting an illicit affair with her chamberlain and faced punishment that included forced marriage to a man she detested and permanent exile from the imperial court. The scandal had rocked the Western Empire, as Honoria was not merely an imperial family member, but a potential heir to the throne in her own right. Her affair represented both a personal betrayal of imperial dignity and a political threat to the succession arrangements that maintained stability within the royal household. In desperation, she secretly dispatched a letter to Attila, along with her personal ring as authentication, begging for his protection from what she characterized as persecution by her brother. The exact content of this correspondence has been lost to history, but Attila chose to interpret it as a formal marriage proposal that carried with it a claim to half the Western Empire as dowry. Whether Honoria actually intended such implications, or whether Attila deliberately mischaracterized her plea to provide justification for invasion, the result was the same. When Emperor Valentinian predictably refused to recognize any such arrangement, Attila declared that his honor as a prospective bridegroom had been insulted, and that armed intervention was necessary to claim his rightful inheritance. The diplomatic exchange that followed was a masterpiece of calculated escalation. Attila's demands were presented in language that made compromise impossible, while providing clear justification for military action if they were refused. He demanded not only recognition of his marriage to Honoria, but immediate payment of her dowry in the form of territorial concessions that would have dismembered the Western Empire. Valentinian's response was equally uncompromising, rejecting both the marriage claim and the territorial demands while explicitly threatening military retaliation if Hunnic forces crossed the imperial frontier. Both sides understood that war was now inevitable, but the diplomatic sparring had served important purposes for both leaders. For Attila, the exchange provided legal justification for invasion that satisfied both his own followers and potential neutral observers. He was not attacking Rome out of greed or barbaric aggression, but to defend his legitimate rights as an injured party seeking redress for documented wrongs. For Valentinian, the refusal to negotiate demonstrated that the empire would not be intimidated by barbarian threats, regardless of the military consequences. This was politically necessary to maintain the support of Roman elites, who would have viewed any compromise as cowardly submission to barbarian extortion. In the spring of 451, the Hunnic army crossed the Rhine frontier in overwhelming force. Contemporary estimates of its size vary wildly, but most reliable sources suggest between 60 and 80,000 warriors, making it one of the largest military forces ever assembled in European history to that point. The composition of this army reflected the full diversity of Attila's confederation. At its core were the traditional Hunnic cavalry units that had made his people legendary, mounted archers capable of loosing arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, equipped with the powerful composite bows that could penetrate armor. At ranges that astounded their enemies, supporting them were the heavy cavalry units provided by allied peoples, Alan cataphracts armed with long lances and protected by scale armor, Gothic horsemen experienced in both mounted combat and siege warfare, and Sarmatian nobles whose martial tradition stretched back centuries. Infantry forces included Gepid warriors renowned for their discipline and tactical flexibility, various Slavic tribal contingents whose knowledge of local terrain would prove invaluable, and even some Roman deserters and prisoners of war who had been incorporated into Hunnic service. The speed of the initial advance caught the Roman defenders completely unprepared. Metz fell within days, its garrison overwhelmed before effective resistance could be organized. The city's capture demonstrated the evolution in Hunnic military capabilities. They were no longer limited to raids and quick strikes, but could conduct formal siege operations when necessary. Rheims surrendered after token resistance, its population spared in exchange for immediate compliance with Hunnic demands for tribute and supplies. The surrender was negotiated through intermediaries who understood that resistance would result in the city's complete destruction, while submission offered hope for eventual survival. The Hunnic forces moved with the same terrifying efficiency that had characterized their eastern campaigns, but with an important difference. This time they were advancing toward a specific strategic objective rather than conducting raids designed primarily for psychological impact. Their target was Orléans, a major commercial and administrative centre that controlled crucial river crossings and road junctions in central Gaul. If this city could be captured and held, it would provide an ideal base for further operations against either Paris to the north or the Mediterranean coast to the south. The choice of Orléans as the primary objective demonstrated Attila's sophisticated understanding of strategic geography. The city commanded the Loire River Valley, one of the most important transportation corridors in Gaul. Its capture would effectively cut the province in half, preventing coordination between Roman forces in the north and south. Moreover, Orléans was a symbol of Roman authority in Gaul, a wealthy and well-fortified city that had never fallen to barbarian assault. Its capture would demonstrate Hunnic power in the most convincing possible manner, likely triggering the surrender of other cities that might otherwise resist. The Siege of Orléans would prove to be one of the most crucial military operations in European history, though this wasn't immediately apparent to the participants. For the defenders, it was simply another barbarian attack to be endured until relief arrived. For Attila, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that no Roman stronghold, no matter how well fortified, could resist his will indefinitely. But for Aetius, hastily assembling forces throughout Gaul and beyond, it represented something more fundamental. The moment when the survival of Western civilization would be decided by force of arms rather than diplomatic maneuvering. The alliance of desperation. While Orléans endured the systematic destruction of its outer defences under the impact of Hunnic siege engines, Aetius was engaged in the most complex diplomatic and military enterprise of his career. He faced the challenge of uniting formerly hostile peoples in common cause against a threat that none of them could resist individually. The magnitude of the task was almost overwhelming. The various barbarian peoples who had settled in Gaul over the previous century had spent most of their time fighting each other for territory, resources, and political dominance. Their mutual hostilities ran deep, rooted in generations of warfare, betrayal, and competing claims to the same lands. His first and most crucial target was Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, whose people had settled in southwestern Gaul after years of conflict with imperial forces. The Visigoths possessed exactly the kind of heavy cavalry and siege warfare experience that would be necessary to confront Hunnic military superiority, but they had little reason to risk their lives defending an empire that had often treated them as enemies. The negotiations with Theodoric were delicate and complex, requiring Aetius to balance immediate military necessity against long-term political considerations. The Visigothic king was an experienced ruler who understood that any alliance with Rome would be temporary, lasting only as long as the Hunnic threat remained imminent. Aetius's persuasive arguments combined practical politics with apocalyptic warnings about what Hunnic victory would mean for all the settled peoples of Gaul. He pointed out that Attila's past behaviour suggested no interest in ruling conquered territories directly, but rather in extracting maximum wealth before moving on to new targets. A Hunnic victory would leave the Visigoths facing the same choice between submission and destruction that had already been forced upon so many other peoples. The Frankish kingdoms presented a different challenge, as they were divided among multiple rulers whose relationships with both Rome and each other were complicated by generations of shifting alliances and territorial disputes. Some Frankish chieftains saw opportunity in Roman weakness and were inclined to support Attila in hopes of gaining advantage over their rivals. Others recognized that Hunnic domination would ultimately eliminate their independence, regardless of any temporary benefits from collaboration. The Franks had maintained their traditional warrior culture more completely than some other Germanic peoples, and many of their leaders understood instinctively that submission to Attila would mean the end of their way of life. Aetius managed to secure the active support of several major Frankish contingents, while neutralizing others through a combination of threats and promises about post-war territorial arrangements. The agreements reached were necessarily vague about specific details, but they established the principle that faithful allies would be rewarded with enhanced status and expanded territories after victory. Even more surprisingly, he succeeded in recruiting significant numbers of Alans, Burgundians, and other barbarian peoples who had previously been allied with or subject to Hunnic authority. This required delicate negotiations that balanced immediate military necessity against long-term political considerations, as these peoples would need to be integrated into whatever post-war order emerged from the conflict. The defection of these groups from Hunnic allegiance was a major diplomatic victory for Aetius, demonstrating that Attila's confederation was not as stable as it appeared. Many of the peoples under Hunnic authority were motivated primarily by fear and the prospect of immediate gain rather than genuine loyalty to Attila's cause. The negotiations were conducted in secret, often through intermediaries who could deny any connection to Roman authorities if discovered. The defecting peoples demanded guarantees of protection against Hunnic retaliation, assurances that their traditional customs would be respected, and promises of territorial rewards commensurate with their military contributions. The army that Aetius ultimately assembled represented one of the most diverse military coalitions in ancient history. Romans served alongside Visigoths who had recently been their enemies, while Frankish warriors fought next to Alans whose tribes had been raiding Frankish territory just months earlier. Burgundian infantry marched beside Sarmatian cavalry, while various smaller Germanic and Celtic tribes contributed specialised units whose local knowledge and particular skills enhanced the coalition's overall effectiveness. The linguistic diversity alone was staggering. Orders had to be translated into a dozen different languages, and coordination required interpreters and cultural liaisons. What held this unlikely alliance together was the recognition that Attila represented an existential threat to all their separate ways of life. Victory would allow them to return to their traditional rivalries and conflicts, but defeat would mean subjugation under a power that had already demonstrated its willingness to destroy any people who resisted its authority. The coalition was fragile in many respects. Mutual suspicions ran deep, coordination was difficult, and many of the participants were more interested in protecting their own territories than in achieving overall victory, but it possessed certain advantages that partially offset its weaknesses. The diverse composition of the alliance meant that it could respond effectively to different types of threats and operate successfully in various terrain and weather conditions. The personal motivations of the participants, fighting for their homes and families rather than for abstract political goals, provided a level of commitment that mercenary armies could rarely match. Most importantly, the coalition possessed defensive advantages that favoured its particular strengths while minimising Hunnic advantages. Fighting on familiar territory, supplied by local populations and motivated by desperation, the Allied forces could potentially overcome the mobility and tactical superiority that had made Attila's army invincible in previous campaigns. The total strength of this coalition is impossible to determine with precision, as the various contingents arrived at different times and many kept poor records of their numbers. Modern estimates suggest approximately 60,000 warriors, making the opposing forces roughly equal in size but vastly different in composition and tactical doctrine. The numerical parity was deceptive, however, as it concealed fundamental differences in organisation, equipment, and combat experience. Attila's army was a professional military force with standardised training and equipment, unified command structure, and extensive experience in coordinated operations. The coalition army was essentially a collection of separate military units with different tactical traditions, incompatible equipment, and limited experience in large-scale cooperation. The fields of decision. The climactic confrontation occurred on the Catalonian plains, near the modern city of Troyes in northeastern France. The location was significant, representing the geographic and cultural boundary between the nomadic world of the steppes and the agricultural civilization of Western Europe. Here, in rolling countryside that provided adequate space for large-scale cavalry maneuvers while offering no decisive tactical advantage to either side, the two greatest military forces of the age would test their strength against each other in what many participants understood might be the final battle for the soul of European civilization. The choice of battlefield was not accidental, but resulted from a series of strategic moves by both commanders seeking to maximize their respective advantages. Attila preferred open terrain that would allow his cavalry to maneuver freely and use their superior mobility to outflank and overwhelm enemy formations. Aetius sought to minimize Hunnic mobility advantages while creating opportunities for his diverse coalition forces to employ their particular strengths in coordinated attacks. The Catalonian plains offered a compromise that neither commander found entirely satisfactory, but both could accept as providing reasonable prospects for victory. The day chosen for battle was June 20th, 451 AD, when the summer sun was approaching its longest arc across the sky. According to tradition, the sun had not yet reached its zenith when the Visigothic advance guard encountered the forward elements of Gepid cavalry, serving under Hunnic command. The initial collision was devastating in its intensity. Warriors who had spent their lives training for exactly this kind of encounter suddenly found themselves locked in hand-to-hand combat that would determine not just their personal survival, but the fate of kingdoms and the future of their children. The sound of the impact could be heard for miles across the plains, the thunder of thousands of horses colliding at full gallop, the crash of weapons against shields and armour, the screams of wounded men and animals. The ground shook under the weight of the charging cavalry, and clouds of dust rose to obscure the sun. Soon the entire plain was covered in the dust raised by tens of thousands of horses and men, a choking cloud that obscured vision and turned the battlefield into a confused maze of individual combats and unit actions. The din was overwhelming, the clash of weapons against armour and shields, the screams of wounded men and horses, the shouted commands of officers trying to maintain unit cohesion in the chaos. The dust clouds created additional tactical challenges for both armies. Visual communication became impossible beyond short distances, making it difficult for commanders to assess the progress of battle or coordinate the movements of separated units. The advantage shifted to armies with better discipline and training, as only well-drilled troops could maintain formation and respond appropriately to changing circumstances without constant visual supervision. The Hunnic battle plan reflected Attila's characteristic preference for concentrated force applied at the enemy's weakest point. His primary assault targeted the coalition's centre, where Alan cavalry protected the Roman infantry that formed the backbone of Aetius's army. If the Alans could be broken and scattered, the entire coalition line would collapse, leaving the various barbarian contingents isolated and vulnerable to defeat in detail. It was a sound strategy that had succeeded in dozens of previous engagements, but it required overcoming opponents who understood the stakes and were prepared to die rather than yield. The Alan cavalry units that bore the brunt of the initial Hunnic assault were among the finest heavy cavalry forces in the world, warriors whose families had perfected mounted combat techniques over generations of warfare on the steppes. They fought with the discipline of professional soldiers and the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant extinction for their people. From his command position on a low hill overlooking the battlefield, Aetius could observe the ebb and flow of combat while dispatching reserve units to threatened sections of his line. His experience in nomadic warfare served him well, as he could anticipate Hunnic tactical movements and position his forces to counter them effectively. The command system that Aetius had developed for managing his diverse coalition forces proved its worth under the extreme pressures of combat. Orders were transmitted through multiple channels using different languages and cultural protocols appropriate to each contingent, ensuring that instructions reached their intended recipients, despite the chaos and confusion of battle. The most critical moment came when King Theodoric of the Visigoths fell in the midst of the fighting. According to some accounts, he was struck down by a Hunnic lance while leading a cavalry charge. Others suggest he was thrown from his horse and trampled by his own men in the confusion of a melee. His death could have shattered Visigothic morale and led to the collapse of the entire right wing of the coalition army. The Visigoths revered their king not only as a political leader, but as a symbol of their national identity and independence. His loss represented not just a tactical setback, but a spiritual catastrophe that threatened to destroy their will to fight. Instead, his son Thorismund managed to rally the Visigothic warriors and actually launch a successful counterattack against the Hunnic right flank, demonstrating the kind of leadership and personal courage that could inspire men to fight beyond their normal limits. The young prince's performance in this moment of crisis established his legitimacy as his father's successor, while providing the coalition forces with a much-needed psychological victory. The Visigothic counterattack demonstrated that Hunnic forces were not invincible when faced with opponents who possessed both courage and tactical skill. The success encouraged other coalition units to press their own attacks more aggressively, creating a series of local victories that began to shift the overall momentum of the battle. As the long day progressed and casualty lists mounted on both sides, it became clear that neither army possessed sufficient advantage to achieve decisive victory. The coalition forces were holding their positions despite enormous pressure, while the Hunnic attacks, though delivered with characteristic ferocity and skill, were unable to achieve the breakthrough that would turn tactical engagement into strategic triumph. The stalemate was particularly frustrating for Attila, whose previous victories had typically been achieved through rapid tactical success that allowed him to exploit enemy weakness before they could organize effective resistance. The prolonged nature of the battle favored the coalition forces, who were fighting defensively on familiar terrain with shorter supply lines. When darkness finally fell over the blood-soaked plain, Both armies remained in possession of the ground they had held at dawn. The field between them was littered with thousands of bodies representing every people and nation involved in the conflict, a grim testament to the stakes for which they had been fighting. Neither Attila nor Aetius could claim victory in any meaningful sense, but the strategic implications were unmistakable. For the first time in his career, Attila had been stopped by military force. His aura of invincibility had been shattered, and his army had suffered casualties that couldn't easily be replaced. The psychological impact of the battle's outcome was perhaps more important than its immediate military consequences. Attila's reputation had been built on the belief that he was irresistible in combat, that opposition to his will was futile, and that submission was the only rational response to his demands. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains had demonstrated that these beliefs were false. The retreat that changed history, the morning after the battle, brought a decision that surprised both armies and would profoundly influence the subsequent course of European history. Despite maintaining his position through the night and retaining sufficient strength for continued fighting, Attila ordered a withdrawal from the battlefield. This retreat was conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized his advance into Gaul. There was no panic, no abandonment of wounded comrades or military equipment, no dissolution of unit discipline that might have allowed the coalition forces to turn tactical stalemate into strategic rout. The withdrawal demonstrated the professional quality of Attila's army and the loyalty that bound his diverse followers together. Units that had suffered heavy casualties maintained their formation and fighting effectiveness, while the complex logistics of moving a large army with its wounded and equipment were handled with impressive efficiency. The Hunnic supply trains were brought forward in good order, the wounded were loaded onto wagons, and the various tribal contingents maintained their formation and fighting effectiveness as they began the long march back toward the Rhine frontier and the safety of their Pannonian homeland. Aetius made the strategically sound but controversial decision not to pursue the retreating enemy. He understood that his own forces were too exhausted and too badly mauled to risk a running battle against an army that remained dangerous and well commanded despite its failure to achieve victory. More importantly, he recognized that the coalition he had assembled for this desperate enterprise was held together only by shared recognition of the Hunnic threat. With that threat now removed, at least temporarily, the old rivalries and conflicts among his various allies would inevitably reassert themselves. If the Visigoths became too powerful through further battlefield success, they might pose a greater long-term threat to Roman authority in Gaul than the Huns themselves. If the Frankish contingents gained too much prestige from participating in a decisive victory over Attila, they might be encouraged to challenge imperial control over territories they considered rightfully theirs. The decision not to pursue was also influenced by practical considerations of logistics and communication. The coalition army was operating far from its supply bases, with limited provisions and uncertain lines of communication back to friendly territory. A pursuit into hostile territory might have resulted in the destruction of the very forces that had achieved the unexpected victory. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was thus perceived by contemporaries as Attila's first significant setback, the moment when his reputation for invincibility was permanently tarnished. But it was equally significant as a demonstration that the diverse peoples of Western Europe could unite effectively when faced with an existential threat to their separate ways of life. The immediate strategic consequences were profound. Attila's withdrawal from Gaul eliminated the immediate threat to the Western Empire's most valuable provinces, while his failure to achieve decisive victory encouraged other potential enemies to reconsider their relationships with Hunnic power. Several tribal leaders who had been considering abandoning their Roman alliances in favour of joining Attila's confederation instead renewed their commitments to the imperial cause. The tribute payments that had been flowing from Constantinople were reduced as Byzantine confidence in their military capabilities was partially restored. But perhaps most importantly, the battle demonstrated that Attila was not the irresistible force of nature that his propaganda had claimed. He was a brilliant military leader commanding a formidable army, but he was also a mortal man whose strategies could be countered and whose forces could be defeated by opponents with sufficient courage, skill, and determination. This realization would profoundly influence the final chapter of Attila's life, as he sought to restore his damaged reputation through an even more ambitious campaign that would ultimately lead him to the bridal chamber where Ildico's tears would mark the end of an era. The aftermath of the battle also revealed the fundamental weakness of Attila's empire. Built around his personal authority and held together by his individual charisma, the Confederation began to show signs of strain as soon as his aura of invincibility was compromised. Several allied peoples withdrew their support, while others demanded renegotiation of their terms of service. The Italian gambit, after withdrawing from Gaul following his setback at the Catalonian plains, Attila demonstrated that his ambitions remained undiminished by launching an audacious invasion of Italy itself. This campaign proved initially successful, with Hunnic forces capturing several major cities including Aquileia, whose destruction was so complete that refugees from its ruins would later found Venice on the islands of the Adriatic lagoon. The invasion of Italy represented a significant escalation in Attila's war against Rome, moving from attacks on peripheral provinces to a direct assault on the heartland of Western imperial power. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time in centuries, barbarian armies were operating freely in the Italian peninsula, threatening the very symbol of Roman authority. The capture of Aquileia demonstrated that Hunnic military capabilities had evolved to meet the challenges of siege warfare against heavily fortified cities. The city's walls, which had successfully resisted previous barbarian attacks, were systematically breached using a combination of traditional nomadic tactics and sophisticated engineering techniques learned from captured Roman specialists. The destruction of Aquileia sent shockwaves throughout the Western Empire, proving that no city, regardless of its fortifications or strategic importance, was safe from Hunnic assault. The psychological impact was amplified by the thoroughness of the destruction. The city was not merely captured but obliterated, serving as a warning to other communities that might consider resistance. But the Italian campaign also revealed the limitations of Hunnic power when extended too far from its steppe homeland. Operating in the mountainous terrain of northern Italy, far from their traditional supply sources and faced with unfamiliar tactical challenges, Attila's forces began to experience the kind of logistical difficulties that had historically plagued nomadic armies. Diplomatic intervention by Pope Leo I, combined with outbreaks of disease among the Hunnic forces and threats of Eastern Roman intervention, persuaded Attila to withdraw from the Italian peninsula without achieving his ultimate objective of capturing Rome itself. The meeting between Attila and Pope Leo became one of the most famous encounters in European history, symbolizing the confrontation between barbarism and civilization, paganism and Christianity, destruction and preservation. According to Christian sources, the Pope's spiritual authority and eloquent arguments convinced the pagan warlord to spare the Eternal City. More likely, the withdrawal was motivated by practical considerations of military logistics and strategic calculation. Attila's army was suffering from disease and supply shortages, while reports indicated that Eastern Roman forces were preparing to intervene in support of their Western colleagues. The decision to withdraw demonstrated Attila's continued strategic flexibility and his ability to recognize when circumstances required tactical retreat rather than continued advance. Unlike many conquerors who became obsessed with immediate objectives at the expense of long-term planning, he retained the capacity to modify his goals when conditions changed. The final mystery. It was in this context of frustrated ambition and incomplete conquest that Attila arranged his marriage to Ildico, a young woman whose Germanic name suggests she may have been taken from one of the many peoples under Hunnic domination. The wedding was celebrated with traditional steppe festivities involving massive consumption of food and drink, honouring customs that stretched back countless generations. The marriage feast represented more than personal celebration. It was a political statement designed to demonstrate that Attila's power remained intact despite his recent setbacks. The elaborate preparations, the wealth displayed in gifts and decorations, and the attendance of representatives from throughout the Confederation all served to reinforce his status as supreme leader. But on the morning after the ceremony, Attila was found dead in the bridal chamber, his new wife weeping beside his motionless form. The circumstances of his death immediately became the subject of speculation and rumour that would persist long after the collapse of his empire. Some contemporary accounts, influenced by Roman hopes and Christian morality, suggested that divine justice had finally struck down the Scourge of God at the moment of his earthly triumph. Others proposed more prosaic explanations: excessive drinking during the wedding celebration, a burst blood vessel brought on by years of stress and warfare, or simply the natural death of a man who had lived a hard life in violent times. But more sinister possibilities were whispered in the felt tents of the royal encampment. Ildico herself was regarded with suspicion by some Hunnic nobles, who wondered whether her tears represented genuine grief or carefully concealed satisfaction at a successful assassination. Had she been planted among Attila's new wives by enemies seeking revenge for countless acts of destruction and conquest? The mystery deepened when it became clear that no investigation would be conducted into the circumstances of the death. Attila's closest advisors moved quickly to prevent any inquiry that might destabilize the Confederation at such a crucial moment. Whether this was to protect Ildico from unjust suspicion or to conceal evidence of a larger conspiracy would never be determined. The truth died with Attila in that chamber, taking with it not only the secret of his final moments, but the driving force that had held together the largest nomadic empire in European history. Without his iron will and strategic vision to maintain unity among the Confederation's diverse peoples, the structure he had built began to fragment almost immediately. His sons attempted to divide their inheritance according to traditional steppe custom, but none possessed their father's unique combination of military genius, political cunning, and personal charisma that could command unquestioning loyalty from dozens of formerly independent tribes. Elek, the eldest son, inherited the core Hunnic territories and attempted to maintain his father's policies of aggressive expansion and tribute extraction from Roman territories. However, he lacked Attila's diplomatic skills and strategic patience, leading to conflicts that dissipated Hunnic strength without achieving corresponding gains. Dengizic and Ernak, Attila's other sons, received smaller portions of the Confederation, but similarly failed to replicate their father's success. Internal conflicts between the brothers weakened the entire structure, while subject peoples began to reassert their independence as central authority collapsed. Within a generation, the peoples who had served under Attila's banner were scattered across Europe, some settling permanently in new territories, others resuming their nomadic wanderings, still others being absorbed into the expanding kingdoms that would define the medieval world. The enduring legacy. Attila's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political consequences of his empire's dissolution. He had demonstrated to the civilized world that its walls and treaties provided no permanent security against a determined enemy who understood how to exploit weakness and capitalize on fear. The precedent he established, of barbarian leaders who could match Roman diplomatic sophistication with steppe military effectiveness, would inspire countless imitators in the centuries that followed. From the Arab conquests of the 7th century to the Mongol invasions of the 13th, successful nomadic leaders would study Attila's methods and adapt them to their own circumstances. His organizational innovations, particularly his success in creating unified command structures among diverse tribal peoples, influenced the development of subsequent steppe empires. The techniques he developed for managing multi-ethnic coalitions, for maintaining discipline among nomadic warriors, and for coordinating complex military operations across vast distances became standard practices for later conquerors. The psychological warfare methods that Attila pioneered, the deliberate cultivation of terror, the strategic use of mercy and cruelty, the importance of reputation and propaganda in achieving political objectives became fundamental elements of military strategy that continued to influence warfare long after the collapse of his empire. Perhaps most significantly, Attila's career demonstrated the potential for individual genius to reshape the political landscape of an entire continent. His rise from obscure tribal prince to master of Europe showed that traditional hierarchies and established institutions could be overthrown by leaders who possessed the vision, skill, and determination to create new forms of organization and authority. The fear and respect that his name continued to inspire centuries after his death testified to the profound impact of his achievements. Medieval chroniclers, Renaissance historians, and modern scholars have all struggled to comprehend how one man could have wielded such enormous influence over the course of European development. His empire may have died with him, but the memory of what he had accomplished lived on, inspiring both admiration and terror in equal measure. The title Scourge of God became synonymous with the concept of divine retribution made manifest in human form, a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations remained vulnerable to the sudden appearance of exceptional individuals capable of overturning the established order. In the end, Attila's greatest victory may have been his transformation from historical figure into mythical archetype, the embodiment of the forces of change that periodically sweep away old certainties and create space for new possibilities. Whether viewed as destroyer or catalyst, monster or genius, his legacy ensured that his name would echo through the centuries as a symbol of the power of human will to reshape the world according to its vision. The story that began with Ildico's tears in a bridal chamber thus encompasses far more than the life and death of one remarkable man. It is the story of how individual ambition and collective destiny intersected at a crucial moment in European history, creating consequences that would influence the development of Western civilization for centuries to come.